teach a course at the University of Nebraska, a master's class that is really focused on the workplace, the future of the workplace, what that looks like, especially amongst a group of students that have never been in a workplace, right? So it's really, where are they heading and what does that look like in their mind? So it's been a really great way to have a dialogue basically across the entire spectrum. So glad to be here.
Fantastic, thank you. Layla?
Hi everyone, I'm Layla van Alvensleben. I am based in Switzerland. Previously, I have worked at fully remote teams and companies for the past 10 years. My background is in UX design, and then I shifted over to culture in distributed teams, as well as thought leadership in new ways of working. My most recent role was at Mural, the online whiteboard, and now I'm working as a remote work coach and collaboration designer. And my main focus is really looking at how to make people feel connected and like they belong at their company and align with the company's values, and looking at how to design better collaboration experiences.
Fantastic, thanks for that. And Susanna?
Hello, everyone. I'm Susanna Barak. I'm the Vice President of Global Workplace Strategy at Swiss Re, where we're really taking a look at how the future of work is going to be impacting our spaces, our real estate strategy, but also looking at other elements such as health and well-being, engagement, and productivity. My speciality actually comes from my education in biopsychology and health and well-being in the workplace, and I have a particular interest in neurodiversity at work and how we could be creating much more inclusive workspaces.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And Joe?
Joe Rokes, Vice President of Strategic Accounts with Space Store. I'm based in California, specifically the Bay Area.
Awesome, thank you, Joe. And I'm Gordon MacDonald, VP of Strategic Accounts here at Space Store, and I am based in Philadelphia and look after a lot of our financial and insurance accounts. So this is going to be a really lively discussion. Please, any questions that you have, we're going to attempt to answer them all. Put them in the Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen, or if you're joining us from LinkedIn Live, please put them in the chat button and we will be sure to answer them. Our panelists are looking forward to your questions. So let's kick off today's topic about defining this future landscape for work. I thought we had an interesting discussion earlier in the week where one of the conversations came out about designing a workplace experience, not just the workplace. And I thought that was a really interesting topic to get kicked off with, is, really what does the workplace mean to us today? But it's beyond just the physical space, but actually the experience. And can you have that same experience remote? So that being said, I would love to get your insights. And why don't we start off with Jeremy? Why don't you tell us a little bit about what's happening at DLR Group and how you're directing your clients as well as your own teams with this whole future of work?
Yeah, thanks, Gordon. As we said, it was a really rich conversation we had earlier this week. And I think, where I'll at least start the conversation is most companies right now, many companies are trying to figure out, as people are coming back, we went from a place where really there was a sea of desks that was primarily around individual work, and then of course meetings and so forth that happened throughout the day, to a shift where we realized you don't need to come into work to just do that individual stuff. That can happen really anywhere, and it's not even a conversation around home or the office. It's really anywhere you are. I mean, even in introductions, it's a little interesting that we say where we're sitting, because does it even matter right now, really, right? We build teams across the country, across the globe, because it's really alignment of the right people with the right company now versus the best of who's sitting around you. So it's been a shift in that thinking. And so that kind of gets at, as we come back into the office now, we're really there for intentional reasons, that you want to bring people together to either, collaborate as a team because there's something there that you can't have elsewhere, whether that be, in our case, that might be a laser cutter, or it might be a certain type of setup that allows for a certain kind of engagement. And that same thing applies when it's remote. It should still be very intentional, right? Not just what's good enough. And so I think, at a very high level, that's been the biggest thing, is understanding and going through the workshopping it takes to understand a company culture, how they work, and then realigning their space. Everyone's looking for, I think, is there one answer? But the reality is there's not one answer. It's a spectrum of answers, and it's everywhere along there. And so it really is, you need to take the time in the beginning to figure out what is right for your situation.
Yeah, that's incredibly insightful. And I think, as companies grapple with what to do with their physical real estate, it does also bring up always the question about the remote. And so just wondering, Darcy, you've got a lot of insight into this area. What is it?
Well, it's a lot of things. And I think, when we talk about experience, that's really what the next generation and we're looking for, I think, in our lives is we want to have a good experience, whether we're going to the dentist, which isn't normally a great experience, or whether we're going to work. And so really thinking about separating place and work and understanding how do we map what we want people to say, feel, think, and do at every moment from hire to retire, regardless if there is a physical space or not. And I think, you really hit on the point, Jeremy, of intentionality. The office for so long, unfortunately for many companies, and this is just by default, the office masked a lot of, inefficient processes. And I think that it just sort of became a container for people to figure out how to move. And the way the office was designed tells you if there's a couch there, it's okay to sit on it. It's okay to move through space because there are certain cues in the office. When the office is removed, we actually have to think about that process and that experience of how do we use language, values, behavior, and experience mapping throughout this process to help people understand how to behave, what to expect, and why they're going through this process. So if people right now are being asked to come into the office because of snacks, well, we know that's probably not going to work. And so thinking about the purpose and the design behind the why of each moment, people need to be in a certain space. And is it really for the output of the work, or is it for bonding? And we talked a little bit about this yesterday. This may ruffle a few feathers, but I say that, remote didn't kill culture, it revealed it. And I think that's a really important thing to note when we think about office. Office spaces are one of many containers of culture, but they are not culture. And so I think that's an important distinction that I'd like to just I'll shut up here in a second, just to sort of leave you all with, is just thinking about that is a container, and what do you want to happen within that specific container, deciding that and being intentionally purposeful about that piece.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think viewing our workplaces as a container, what are we going to put in it? How are we going to, and if we need to reshape that, what does that look like? I'm just wondering, Susanna, you've had some thoughts and what you're doing at Swiss Re?
Yeah, and picking up on what Darcy said, I definitely don't disagree. And, going remote certainly revealed a lot of flaws in the way that we work or used to work, and the office space in general. Was it designed properly? Yes or no? But I would probably push back, as I did yesterday, and say that the office certainly is not dead. In my opinion, it is certainly somewhere that enhances the culture and enhances the brand, enhances the experience of work. It's not that we can't do it remote. I mean, this is the great thing about the pandemic. We learned that we could do it remotely. Companies learned how to trust, or they had to learn how to trust very, very quickly. And people had to adapt very, very quickly. If they were not technically savvy before, some people may have never used Zoom or Skype or Teams before, but all of a sudden they had to learn how to do that. They also had to learn how to manage themselves throughout their day. Some did a great job, some less so. But what we're doing at Swiss Re is really trying to understand what the purpose of the office is, and how do we enhance that purpose so that it becomes a magnetic space for people to be drawn to, rather than asking them or telling them they must. Where we're saying, okay, the office is the primary place of work, but saying it and people actually embracing that is another thing. So that's the magic formula that we're trying to discover. And to Darcy's point, it is messy. It is, a lot of companies are struggling with this. What do we do next? Do we just wait and see and hope this all blows over? Or we go back to the way that we used to work? Or do we really need to rethink and find opportunities within that change to actually create a better experience in general?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there was a lot that surfaced during the pandemic that did, in my mind, kind of went back to normal. And I think it's inspiring and exciting that the workplace conversation did not. We're still exploring new concepts, what the workplace of the future should look like. And I'm happy to be part of that discussion. And I think one thing that came up in a few recent conversations was just all being honest with ourselves and being okay with no one's good at it. Like, we've just got to take that first step and experiment and figure out, just take the first leap and see where it goes from there. So Layla, I'm curious for your thoughts on kind of what that first step would be, and encouragement to not be afraid to do it wrong the first time.
There I am, unmuted. I love that you're saying that, Joe, because it is all about experimentation. And no one that I know in terms of companies has really cracked the code on how to do hybrid work well. Being all remote is much easier. As soon as the whole company is working exactly the same way, it's much easier, whether that's all in person or whether it's all remote. But the complicated part comes about when it's hybrid, right? When it's some people are remote, some people are in the office, and how to create connections and how to create that sense of belonging and alignment. I say as the first step, so having a leadership team being very transparent about this and having good internal communications is extremely important to make sure that everyone understands the vision that the company has for how we want to work together at a company. And then having somebody, I would say a role like what I had or what Darcy had in her past roles, having somebody who is in charge of bringing about the best practices and the learning and development and the training and the conversations around how can we work better. So somebody could be a head of remote role, or it could be a head of culture role, head of flexible work role. There are many titles. But the title is less important than the actual job description. So having a person who is starting the conversations first with leadership to understand, like, what do they want, but then also understanding who are people who maybe already have this kind of experience. So when I was working at Mural, I found people who already had experience working remotely before joining Mural, which was a remote first company. And then together we started drafting the remote work playbook for Mural. Writing guidelines and documenting is extremely important for that, because first of all, it's accessible for everyone, and making sure that it's a documentation that you can keep editing. It's not like written in stone forever. GitLab is a perfect example of that. They kind of led by example, and they have this playbook that anybody can use and edit. And then finding ways of practicing what these guidelines are and helping people and supporting teams and figuring out what their challenges are. So also having conversations with people, creating small, it could be focus groups, it could be one-on-one interviews, talking to managers or other types of employees, and really understanding at all levels, what are their challenges, what do they need help with, what is actually working well and doesn't need to be changed, but maybe just tweaked a little. And that's where you initially start. And one tool that I found really helpful as well was having regular employee engagement surveys or pulse surveys that you send out to the employee. I would say not more than on a quarterly basis, because every time you send one of these kind of surveys, it takes a lot of time to go through that data depending on the size of the company, and then understanding what are the insights and what are the things that we're going to work on. And if you keep sending the surveys without showing that you're actually, as a company, that you're not working on improving the things that people have brought up in the survey that are not working, that's just going to lead to disappointment and survey fatigue. So very important to find several channels of communication to understand what people are feeling challenged with, and then focusing on maybe 1, 2, or 3 priorities that you're saying, okay, this is what will get done in the next quarter or 2 quarters. And constantly iterating, because as the company evolves and, for example, scales, like we went from a 100+ company to 1,200 company in 2 years, with that kind of explosive growth, it was really hard also to stay on top of everything. So constantly experimenting and realizing that you need to start somewhere, but it's never going to be perfect.
But just on that, and I'd be glad of everyone's thought around this, is what is the, if you were to boil it down to one key benefit between remote first versus in office first, what is that benefit of remote first? What is the, from a company's point of view versus a employee's point of view, what is the benefit of a remote first workplace? Happy if any one of you want to take that question.
Darcy, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I would say I have seen with clients and places I've worked myself in remote first workplaces, when people are given the permission to set themselves up for success in a way that works for their brains, their lives, and their functionality, they do much better work. And I would say the key value there is autonomy, and the autonomy to choose what gives them energy. So whether that's being around their family or in a private space, it doesn't matter. Everybody is different. And Susanna talked a little bit about how she's really passionate about neurodiversity. I think we don't talk enough about how different people are and how different people work. And I really think the key thing here is for a company to understand when employees are managing their energy and not their time, they're actually giving you much, much more, which leads to more profits for your company, deeper engagement. Again, this needs to be architected. And like Layla said, you need, like, culture is co-created and the future of work is co-created, but understanding the needs of different types of people in alignment with the business needs, being remote first allows for so much more talent, magnetism, autonomy, and in a lot of ways belonging if architected correctly.
Yeah, I was going to say something very similar, Darcy, around flexibility for each person. We talk about it. It's important for companies to align with culture. It's also true that individuals need to align with their lives. And I think it's been, one of the things I've hated as an example is we've lost a lot of women in architecture, especially because at different times in their lives, it doesn't work with the demands that architecture and interiors and stuff has just on individuals. And so with the flexibility we've been able to not have that be such a narrative within, and that's true across the entire spectrum. It's it's not limited to that, but I think that's the one thing I don't want to lose, no matter where we end up on the spectrum. I think the flexibility is the thing that people have really learned to love, and that we want to make sure that we maintain in some way, because it allows for both sometimes work to take primary and sometimes for your life to take primary, but there's this spectrum that is constantly flowing. That's been really important for people to see.
I would agree with what you're both saying. I think flexibility, autonomy, choice, personal control, these are all things that are really advantageous by having a flexible work model. I would, however, say that needs to be sort of like a sandbox or some sort of a framework that needs to be put around it, especially for larger organizations, where there is certain work that just seems to happen better when you're in person. We talked a little bit about this yesterday, about the human connection, about those spontaneous collaboration moments that happen around the water cooler. So there are lots of added benefits. And to your point, Jeremy, around women or just parents in general, or people who might have some sort of a disability, to be able to have a choice of where they can do their best work is really I would say the most important benefit of having a flexible work model as to where you work, and that you can work from anywhere. I think those are the main benefits.
You bring, and I love that you bring up I think the greatest thing right now is we're asking why we had some of these spaces. Like you brought up the water cooler, and originally why food programs or cafes were added to a lot of companies was because they wanted to really build on the water cooler idea, right? To get that accidental conversation that turns into the next big idea. And so it was a way to foster that. And then at some point it just became a perk. And then like perks build on perks, and our company has more and yours, and you lose sight of the why behind why did we add a ping pong table in the first place? Why did we add food programs? And now you're, as you're looking at your space, you're getting back to original why did we have these spaces, and it's again very intentional, and so it's not just playing this kind of crazy game of trying to do more than everyone else. And so I think that's been one of the biggest benefits right now.
Totally agree. I mean, and it's not just about the food. I mean, the food's great, and the water cooler and the coffee and all these other things, but it's also how you're designing your space so that you can create these nudges to bring different groups of people together. So it's not, it's a constellation. I know we're talking about, benefits for remote work, and we're sort of going off piece a little bit, but I think, there are benefits to doing remote work, but I think if it's too far off to one side, that I think the happy medium is having a balance between both. And what does that look like? Maybe there's, as we talked about this yesterday, maybe there's a headquarters, but then there's, remote locations where people can come together and work remotely, but within maybe a smaller space where they can connect with their colleagues. So, what does the future look like? I mean, it's probably something that looks like a blend between, the big corporate headquarters and the city centers. And I think, Jeremy, you're probably going to have some thoughts around this, but I think it also, people were moving out, to smaller villages because they can afford it, or, going back to their homes, not commuting into the city every day. So they, bringing that life back into smaller communities and villages, but maybe having hubs there that could be like a remote location where people could still have the opportunity to come together. Could be an interesting model.
There's something I wanted to add real quick also about a benefit of remote work that I've seen, especially when it comes to collaborating, is the inclusivity of it all. So one thing I noticed is, and I've heard from other people as well, is for the first time, once they started working remotely during the pandemic, they felt like they had a seat at the table when it was all on Zoom. I'm not saying that, all meetings are done well, but especially when I was working at Mural, which is very focused on bringing collaboration to life on a virtual whiteboard, everybody could add ideas at the same time. If you have a meeting, people are mute. It's not the loudest person in the room who's going to take all that space. And if I think about my experiences at physical offices, because I did have those over 10 years ago, there was something to be said also about sometimes hierarchy, gender, different kind of energies in the room, different physical spaces, but it's more about the people and the energy that some people bring or don't bring to a physical space. And then all of a sudden, the focus or the main people are talking are always the same ones. And I feel like in remote, in the remote environment, it's much easier to bring everybody on an equal ground, and also make people maybe who are more introverted feel more comfortable, whether that's through Zoom or something like Microsoft Teams or Slack, to just communicate openly and put things out there. And I also think there's something to be said about, this is just on a tangent. We often talk about physical offices as if people in physical offices don't work remotely, which is entirely untrue. The first time I read a book by Jason Fried, the CEO of Basecamp, back then 37 Signals, he was talking about people in office are working remotely all the time. If you're on floor 1 and you're sending an email to somebody on second floor, you're already communicating remotely, whether it's through the phone, email, or whatever it is. So it's also something to think about, that there's a lot of remote work happening already in offices.
Oh, go ahead, Darcy.
Sorry, I was going to say, it's really important to note, Gordon, you mentioned like difference between remote first and office first. And I think, to Layla's point, it's important to also think about, if you have offices, like if you have even 2 people working outside an office, you should be thinking about switching your operations to a remote first operating rhythm and a remote first mindset. And I think that's something that we're forgetting a lot in this. It's sort of the office or remote. However, office first mentality does not translate well in a remote first, when you're trying to go into a remote first environment. We call it the lift and shift. And then people go remotely and they're going remote, and then they have the exact same system and operating rhythm, and you're not getting as much out of your employees because you're on the same schedule, you're in Zoom calls all day. So I think this is this grand opportunity when we think about remote first and the benefits. It's sort of unlocking, creating a new world, rethinking everything we've ever done, restructuring what actually works and what doesn't. And guess what? It's really hard. It's really hard to learn how to behave differently and to really take note of what is working and what isn't. So again, there's no blueprint for your culture, but when you do go think about having anybody who's remote, which I think everybody in this room probably does, it does require rethinking about how you do everything as a culture.
Layla, I was just going to add on to your point. One of the clients we worked with, and we talked about all the testing that's happening, but I really appreciate when companies really take a position and go all the way, instead of you see a lot of companies that are kind of just doing what we did before, but now bringing hybrid in. One of the companies we worked with, they took the position, because exactly what you said, that you have an equity in meetings right now. And, as soon as you jump on a call and somebody goes and, draws on a whiteboard and you can't be in that meeting anymore, you remember what it was like, right? And so they said, we're going to have one person Zooms, everybody Zooms. So if they had a 10-person meeting and one person called in, the other 9 people need to go find a booth, go to their desk, whatever it would be. So it's either all in person or not, because of exactly what you just said. And so we ended up, adding 400 phone booths in the office. But I really appreciated the fact that they took that position, because it is such a different meeting experience. And when you translate that to the office, you have to be really cognizant of it, because even, if there was somebody sitting in the phone booth here with me, it's different than the meeting we would be having with the person that's calling in. So you really do have to think about how that translates.
That's really interesting, because that goes back to the workplace experience piece of it, and then is the physical space actually geared towards that experience? And we're getting some questions in now from the halfway mark here, but one of the questions that came in are, what are some practical tips to enable remote and in-person workers to realize the level playing field? Sometimes it feels like those who are virtual are missing out on the nuances of dialogue, in-person events, and get less recognition. And we spoke about this, we just touched on it briefly, but I think that is back to having that equitable experience. And I'd be glad if whoever wants to answer that question, how do we bring equality into a space? And that example you just gave is fantastic, Jeremy, about, if one person's dialing in, we're all going to dial in, even if I am sitting in the physical office. But wondering if Susanna, you want to answer that, how do we create that equality where somebody doesn't feel like they're missing out because they're not sitting in front of their manager every day versus somebody else that's just joining remotely?
It's a really good question, and I'm sure probably Darcy or Layla are more equipped to answer that from a remote perspective. But from the perspective that I'm coming from, it's really a challenge. I have to say, it really is a challenge, unless you're doing something like what Jeremy suggested, like everybody going off and doing having all remote or all in person to create that equitable experience. But I think the other thing that we can do from a hybrid perspective, that is people being in the room and people being remote, is, obviously there needs to be different behaviors that happen. It's, you can't assume like everybody can hear you or see what you're writing, or, maybe you need to have someone who's actually moderating that meeting in a way that's ensuring that everybody is joining in. But I'd love to hear Darcy and Layla's thoughts on that as well, because it is certainly a challenge for us.
All right, Darcy, you want me to go? I think, it is complicated hybrid. I have to admit, first of all, I worked in remote first companies for the past 10 years and not hybrid. So that's the first thing I will say. But Susanna is right. It's about behaviors and about learning new behaviors. And initially it may not feel very natural, but over time, as people adopt new practices, it can become a little bit more easy to start doing them. So one thing that you mentioned about meetings and moderating really makes me think about the importance of facilitation. And facilitation is so key. It's a skill that is not just for the moderator or the person doing the meeting. Everybody is can be a facilitator if they learn how to. And facilitation is really about guiding people along a process. And once you have that facilitator mindset, you can think, okay, how can I be a better timekeeper? How can I be a better, how can I allow everybody to take part in a more inclusive way? How can we take better notes? How can we be more visual when we collaborate? And I find that having things like notes or a recap or a follow-up after, like all these things that is just not, it's not like if you're not present at the meeting, you're going to miss everything out, but really thinking about how can this experience be something that everybody can take part in at some point? And let's say there is a group of people that is in a room and the others can't join. Well, maybe they can also think about, oh, we made a joke or something. The other person may not have heard it. Like, say it again. If there's a facilitator, they'd be like, well, that was really funny, but I don't think, the other person online heard it. Would you mind repeating it or sharing it? But I do think if we can find tools like, it could be a Google Doc, it could be an online whiteboard, things where people are not just depending so much on the video, but also looking at the same screen, whether that's, again, like a whiteboard or something. It allows for people to, first of all, be more engaged during the meeting. So it's not just about talking, you're actually doing something and building onto other people's ideas. And then there are other things that come to mind as initiatives that we did in the past. For example, starting an employee newsletter where we would share once a month or maybe once every 2 months, go around and share what everybody is working on and making it a collaborative newsletter where people can add more stuff, and allowing people to have that communication between each other so that they're not missing out on what's happening, because that's, once silos start being created, it's really a communication problem.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of that. I mean, I think it's really important to think about communication, but I also think it's really important when you're thinking about kind of this equity of experience of people who are outside of the office or in the office, is really thinking about the value of belonging. And again, coming back down to that, like, what do we want people to say, feel, think, and do in these moments? Facilitation is huge. I'll give a real life example of an offsite. Our fully remote team I was planning, and there were about 30% of the company that decided not to come to this offsite. And and that had to do with COVID. It had to do with a lot of different things. But in this offsite, I was bringing in an astronomer. I was bringing in an astronomer, not an astrologer. And we were going to be looking at the stars in Arizona and kind of mapping the stars. And the budget per person I still had for the people that were at home. And something I did was I bought telescopes for everybody who was at home to be able to map the stars in their own kind of respected location and then get together to kind of share those maps. So again, they're having a semi-similar experience, and they're not feeling left out like, oh my gosh, these people get to be with this a professional astronomer. They're still able to kind of receive that information and get to create their own experience. And so I think, but it's still collective. So being really creative, you really are, when you're a hybrid company, you are one company, but you are creating two cohesive experiences in a lot of ways. And it is harder. And that's why that facilitation, that head of flexible work, that somebody on each team kind of being tasked with thinking about and paying attention to these moments and responding and reacting and adjusting to them is really important for that human need of belonging.
And I just want to add on real quick for physical space, just how some of this stuff does need to translate. If you do have a space that's going to have people calling into it, like rip down the whiteboards. You got to have two-way communication, and you've got to allow the people that are calling in remotely to interact in the same way that the people in the room are. And so that's where I think, smart boards and those kinds of things can work. We would often use, Mural or Miro or something like that, because you can use it with a pen or whatever you want in the room, much like a chalkboard or a whiteboard. But then the people that are calling in can do the same thing. As you're all seeing the same things, you got to have communication that can go both ways, or else you immediately, again, like I said, as soon as somebody gets up and draws on a whiteboard, you've taken out whatever half of the room is not sitting there.
I wanted to add one quick tip to that also is if you do have a meeting or a workshop, let's say, asking for feedback at the end in a very simple way, maybe anonymously, like rate this meeting or rate this workshop. And you can even do it, if you do it in a whiteboard, have like pre-design, a place where people can rate it with 5 stars, 4 stars, or whatever, how many stars they want. And once you start getting that feedback and maybe even collecting more specific feedback in words, not just with like a rating, that's going to help a lot to iterate each time, because otherwise you're just repeating the same mistake again and again without realizing that a simple tweak could be very helpful. Like, let's say starting the meeting 5 minutes, like doing a check-in or some kind of warm-up activity first, so that people online and can connect, or people in the physical space can all arrive at the office. Technically, we should be on time, but even, for example, today I was in a traffic jam and I came just in time for this webinar. So just having ways where you can get that feedback in a very fast, uncomplicated method, it really goes a long way.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I could certainly see benefits of some meetings being, virtual and having protocols and kind of guidelines, best practices. For me, my personal, I believe that we are social beings. My ideal meeting is laptops in the corner of a room and we're all around a circle table and we're having a conversation with one another, that we're using all of our different senses. To me, that physical being with people means a lot. That's my preference, which I think the variety is good. I can certainly see benefits of both. Jeremy, I'm curious for a question for you. As you're teaching your program for some new folks getting into the industry, what questions are they asking, knowing that there's articles saying that the workplace is dead, but what people are studying it, and I think that that's very inspiring. What type of questions are these kind of the next generation asking?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets at where we started with everything really being driven by experiences. And I, we talked a little bit about this, that it needs to be a shift in thinking, that there was a place you went to work and then a place you went that was not work, that was home, or what you did at night or whatever. And we start to shift cities to be much more holistic in thinking. And so a lot of what we spend on is our time talking about is really adaptive reuse of all of these office towers, especially 70s, 80s, and 90s, the punch windows that are really the first places that people are leaving and the last that they'll come back to, and they're difficult to convert. And so we need to just start to think about cities as places that we want to spend time in as a full experience, that includes work, that includes what's after work, it includes these really great I think full spectrum places. And it's part of the reason you're seeing a shift, I think, away, well, in certain cities, right, away from the urban core, and also the rise of a lot of kind of mid-tier cities. We talked a little about this yesterday: Columbus, Nashville, all Kansas City, all these places that were always there, obviously, but now that they offer a little bit of that spectrum, that you can drive into work relatively easy, you can get around. There's tend to be a lot more entertainment and so forth that we're downtown. Sports are closer. It's just easier to get around, and so you're seeing a chance for some of these cities to grow versus kind of the historic city that was really divided between kind of a day and night life. And so I think you're going to really start to see a shift in our big metropolitans to really think about what that looks like in a much more of a mixed use application. And so that's what the students have really been talking about. They want to go somewhere that it might be you can play basketball or pickleball, whatever you want to do, and right next to it is your office, and right next to that is an outdoor space. And so I think that's a big part of it. I'm sure everybody has a lot of thoughts around that, but much more holistic cities, I think, is where we're heading.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. We do have a few questions in, so I'll put this one to you, Susanna. This one came in via LinkedIn from Joe. Thoughts on how remote working is on juniors or trainees who need to shadow colleagues to learn?
And this is one of the primary reasons why we're asking people to come back into the office, is to learn from each other and to collaborate with each other. There, of course, are benefits to working remotely, and there's no doubt about that. And we strongly believe that the office is still the primary place of work, the primary place to learn from each other, especially for those who are entering the workforce, to learn from people who are seasoned within that business. So yes, you can work remotely, but again, these sort of spontaneous moments and conversations and these opportunities to collaborate are also learning opportunities for those people who are entering the workforce. So for us, the workplace is certainly one of the primary places not only to work, but also to learn.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was just thinking that I think that came in earlier in the week. Somebody had mentioned about, workplaces becoming learning labs. And I thought that was really interesting because, that's why we want to go somewhere. We want to learn from other people. We want to, collect new ideas, sit down with a cup of coffee or, share lunch with one of our colleagues and learn from them, catch up with them. And just wondering, that comes into a comment from Alex on LinkedIn. We had a comment from a client recently who said they wholeheartedly embraced the hybrid working, but didn't support hybrid meetings. So that's an interesting comment. I don't know, Darcy, if you want to take that one. How do we, when we need to get together in person, how are we going to design a space for that?
Well, I think we already touched on the hybrid meeting piece of really creating that equity of experience. So, I mean, I'm not sure kind of what the question is here. I think can you repeat the comment and question?
He was just pointing out one of their clients wholeheartedly embraces the hybrid working, but didn't support hybrid meetings, which I think is interesting, that when a meeting needs to happen, can we have it, it needs to be in person. So that again goes back to a little bit about, how do we bring the two things together, the remote piece, and then when we have a meeting, we have to have that in person. So,
well, I think there's a difference between a meeting and a ritual. And I think that's something to really think about when we're thinking about reconstructing these spaces. And so you want people to come out of a time being together physically, synchronously, re-energized, having built trust, having to be excited about the next 3 months, 6 months, next week, whatever these rituals are codified. So I think when we're thinking about meetings, I think it's sort of probably a disservice to think about that we have to have everybody in person to have a meeting, especially if you have a distributed organization. That sounds incredibly expensive and really exhausting in a lot of ways to me. So I think about, okay, what is this meeting? Is this a ritual? What do you want out of this time together? What is your ROI to bring these people together? Previously, and with clients, I've worked with teams that don't have real estate or might have real estate, and they only use that real estate to bring everybody together quarterly, or maybe it's twice a year. And those times are intentionally designed for a specific result. So I don't disagree that maybe everybody needs to be in person for a certain amount of time, but saying that for all meetings, that just sounds exhausting. And so I really think about that purpose, that container. What do I want out of it? What is that experience? And thinking about it in that way. And I'd really, really start to think about what are the rituals companies already have in their company? Is it a yearly anniversary? Is it a quarterly sales kickoff? Like, what are these rituals that already exist that people are tied to? And then building these in-person moments around those rituals that are already culturally relevant, so people understand the reason behind why they're coming together in person, why they're giving up or giving up family time, or giving up kind of their restructure of life and rhythm they've already gotten into to come together for a purpose. So that's what I would offer, and hopefully that hopefully I hit that in the note that they were looking for.
If I may just piggyback off of that, first of all, I don't know about the rest of the people in the panel or people in the audience, but we have seen such a rise in the number of meetings that are taking place. People are literally sitting down at whatever o'clock in the morning until, whatever o'clock in the evening, maybe like begging for a bio break or, a bite to eat or something like that. So to Darcy's point, I think it's really important, not only are we thinking about, where we're doing work, but again, how we are working, and are these meetings really even required? Couldn't you just like get up and go talk to somebody? This is another thing, or pick up the phone. are the number of meetings that we're having really necessary? And the other interesting phenomenon we're seeing is that, people are in the office, but sitting at their desk all day in Teams meetings. And some of those people are in the same meeting and they're literally sitting beside each other or across from each other and interrupting other meetings that are also happening on. It's just this very strange phenomenon. Let's call it a hangover from the pandemic that's happening. So, I'd love to hear what other, people, especially in the audience, are thinking around this. But certainly the number of meetings and the quality and the types of meetings, certainly I would say personally, from my perspective, needs to be reevaluated. So I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this.
And I, for one, would love to get rid of the word hybrid. I think it's become such a crutch now. I think you have to get back to your company's core values and what is that, and decide, are you remote first? Or are you in person first? It doesn't mean that you don't have, virtual meetings if you're in person first, but you have to decide what you want to build around and be really intentional about it, instead of, I think there's way too many companies right now that just did what we did before. Then we had the pandemic and learned how to work remotely, and now we're kind of just doing a little bit of both. And I think that's exactly what's led to what you're talking about, where we just now we're in the office but in meetings all day, and it's become worse. And I think that's why you're seeing so many people that are just really burned out right now. And part of the reason you're seeing people leave the industry or make shifts is because you're just exhausted, and that's driven by all of that.
Yeah, and it does seem like there's a lot of plans changing, like every quarter. Like come in 2 days a week, come in 3 days a week, go back to come in when you want to, which I understand. I mean, it's hard to find what works best, but defining terms and making the process or the plan clear, I think, is important. Mindful, we've got 8 minutes left. So with that, I will kind of hit everyone up for a closing comment or closing thought for those who have joined us. So I'll start with Darcy.
Sure. So I'll actually just leave a closing thought based on what Joe just said. You get to be whatever you want as a company, as a culture. Like your culture is yours and it is unique. And so I think that stop trying to do what everybody else is trying to do and decide what's right for you. The word flexible, the word remote first, the word office first can mean whatever you want it to mean, but take this time, take the next few months to define what that means for your company, to release the headspace from your employees so they understand their swim lanes, they understand their freedom within the framework, and let them self-select out or into your culture so you have more alignment moving forward.
Brilliant. Well said. All right, Layla. Thank you.
Thanks, Darcy. I think my closing thought is based around a comment I heard at a conference recently, which was that these new ways of working, whether you want to call that remote or hybrid, have really changed the power dynamics. And that is probably what's like freaking out a lot of executives and leaders and managers who only know one way of managing a company, which is in person. And that's the way we've been doing things for the past 100 or more years. And not having that possibility of always seeing what people are doing and thinking, I hear a lot about productivity and like how productivity can happen only if we're all in person all the time. And I disagree. It's been proven in so many ways that, as Darcy mentioned as well, like once people figure out how their energy levels can be improved on once they work remotely or once they're flexible, let's say, productivity can change. If that's really what people are focusing on, who are leading these companies and making these decisions, they really need to look at the actual numbers and what people are feeling. And I think seeing all these statistics, sometimes they're a bit skewed. Like, for example, I know this has become a bit of a long comment, but I saw the other day different generations and like Gen Zs compared to millennials and other generations, and how the percentage of those that wanted to go back to the office. And like it was a bar graph, and the highest bar graph was, I think it was Gen Zs who want to go back to the office millennials less wanted to go to the office less, and so forth. And like the older you were, the less you wanted to go back to the office. But when you actually looked at those numbers, it was only 40% of those Gen Zs that were interviewed that actually wanted to go back to the office, which meant the other 60% also don't want to go back to the office full time. So the closing comment is really look at what people need, and don't, as executives, don't be so attached to what you've only known, because things are going to change, and the sooner you can change and stay up to date with this movement that's happening, this transition, the more likely you are to really hire and retain the talent that you want to have the best company that you want to create.
Awesome. Thank you for that. Susanna. I think you've gone
muted.
Classic error. Well, first of all, I guess my closing thought is, isn't it exciting to be in this world of work? I mean, it is on the front page news. It is being discussed at the C-suite level. It is happening around dinner tables, and all this conversation is happening about how this is changing so much. And, perhaps it is time, in fact, for us to rethink work, life, cities, communities, how these things all come together. And I agree that, to Darcy's point, that everybody, every company and culture is unique, but there's also an opportunity to learn from each other. And maybe we just sort of need to just be very open and have these conversations with each other, because we're all struggling with similar challenges. So within every struggle, there's an opportunity. I suppose that would be my closing comment.
Thanks, Susanna. All right, Jeremy, last stop for the mic drop comment.
That's a great comment, Susanna. And I think one of the things I talk to my students about is, there's probably never been a time in education where the stuff that the designers are studying is more relevant, and what they can bring into the workplace, whether they're studying education or healthcare or the workplace, whatever it might be, it's very relevant, because it's immediately applicable. And that's really exciting that we are in this place where we can be looking and testing something new and not having to wait for an industry to make a shift that usually would take decades to happen. And so it's happening in real time, which is amazing. I think I would say I would challenge companies to do the hard work to figure out what their culture is, what their values truly are, make intentional changes, and don't be afraid to do something and then pivot. But right now, I think there's so many agile solutions on every side of it, whether it be on the furniture side, on the material side, whatever it is. So don't be afraid to test something and then pivot if it's not working. I think we have, no one has the silver bullet right here. We all are going to be doing this, and it's cool because it's not a competition right now. Really, it's as a community, we're all trying to figure this out together, and you're seeing it across the entire industry. We're all sharing what's working, what's not working. We all want this to really shift. And so I think I would say just continue the creativity, the questions, and I think it's going to be great. I think we're going to see a great shift, and it's going to be it's needed to happen for a very long time. So it's a really great moment in time.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. And thank you, everyone, our panelists, for joining. Thank you, everyone who joined on Zoom and LinkedIn Live. This was a great conversation. Hope you found some value in it. Gordon, any final comments from your end?
No, I think it's been really insightful. It's fantastic to get the thoughts from Leila and Darcy on the remote first aspect, and then Jeremy and Susan, certainly ourselves. We're constantly talking to clients about how to bring folks back into the office. But I think just kind of distilling this down has been really insightful. And for me, the key thing I took away was a individual workplace experience. How do we create that and how do we, embrace each other individually for, whatever that experience is. So thank you all very much for joining us. Appreciate the insights. Be on the lookout for our next Insights Live episode 40 coming out shortly. And thanks again to our panelists for taking a few moments of your day to join us and share your insights. We appreciate it as always.
Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.